When Emily walked into the room, it was like the sun had finally decided to shine on the Rust Belt. That is a direct quote from a statement sitting right here in this cardboard file, typed on a ribbon that was already starting to fade in 1987. A kindergarten teacher in a small industrial suburb of Flint, Michigan, wrote those words about a 9-year-old girl who never made it to her 4th grade graduation. Instead, Emily became a ghost in the system, a name whispered in police precincts for over 2 decades. Today, we are cracking the seal on 3 specific cases that were never supposed to be solved. Cases where the trail went cold before the digital age even began. We are talking about killers who lived among us for 25 years, going to PTA meetings and neighborhood barbecues, convinced that the evidence against them had rotted away in the Michigan soil. But they forgot one thing. Science doesn't forget. And the dead have a way of leaving behind small, silver clues that the human eye wasn't even meant to see back in the 80s. Look at this photo, Sam. It's a grainy Polaroid, dated October 27, 1987. You can see the overgrown path behind the housing project. The locals called it the Briar Patch. It's a narrow, jagged shortcut between the residential blocks and the elementary school. Emily took that path every morning. But on this specific Tuesday, her friends, who usually walked with her, were running 5 minutes late. 5 minutes, Sam. That's all it took. When they finally reached the Briar Patch, she was gone. And hours later, when a K9 unit finally caught a scent, they found something that didn't make any sense. They found Emily's body in a patch of wild brush, but she was resting on a pile of cardboard boxes. It had been drizzling all morning. The ground was a muddy mess. But those boxes? They were bone dry. It was as if the killer had prepared a stage for her. The detectives back then were pulling at threads that just kept snapping. They had a description. A young man with curly red hair wearing one of those heavy, patterned Norwegian wool sweaters that everyone in the Midwest seemed to own in the late 80s. He was seen coming out of the Briar Patch right after Emily disappeared. They even found him, a 19-year-old kid named Thomas, who lived in a nearby youth hostel. They sat him down in a room that probably smelled of stale cigarettes and floor wax, and they grilled him. But Thomas was calm. He told them he'd simply overslept for his vocational classes. His story checked out. No blood on his clothes, no scratches on his face, no fingerprints at the scene. In 1987, if you didn't have a witness or a smoking gun, you had nothing. DNA was a term used in specialized labs, not in local courtrooms. So, they let him go. And for the next 25 years, Thomas became a ghost. Fast forward to 2012. The file is sitting on the desk of a cold case investigator who refuses to let the sun set on Emily. He looks at the evidence bags. Inside, there are strips of adhesive tape, what the techs call Folienabzug. Back in '87, they used these tape lifts to gather fibers from the victim's clothing, hoping to match them to a suspect's sweater. They didn't find any fibers back then, but the tape preserved something else. Microscopic skin scales. Human dust that had been trapped under the adhesive for a quarter of a century. And when the lab in 2012 ran those scales through the national database, the screen didn't just give them a sequence, it gave them a name: Thomas. But here's the chilling part, Sam. When they went to find him, they didn't find a monster lurking in the shadows. They found a 45-year-old foreman for a bridge construction company. A man who had been married for 20 years. A man who was a godfather to 4 children. A man described by his neighbors as the pillar of the community. He had lived a perfectly normal life, while Emily's mother spent 25 years wondering what happened in the Briar Patch. When they brought him in, he denied everything. He thought he was safe. But the investigator did something brilliant. He didn't scream at him. He just told Thomas that they were going to turn his life upside down.
We know you were there, Thomas.
They were going to question his wife, his godchildren,
We know
his
you were there,
coworkers.
Thomas. Stop
They were going
wasting-
to tell everyone who he really was. And that's when Thomas broke. Not out of remorse for the little girl he strangled with her own scarf, but out of fear that his carefully constructed mask was about to slip. He asked if they could keep his wife out of it. When they said
Look at
no,
me.
he simply said, Okay, it was me. It makes you wonder how many pillars of the community are walking around today with a secret like that, buried under 25 years of suburban lawn care and Sunday church. But sometimes, the secret isn't buried in a mind, it's buried in the bone. Let's shift gears to August 1984. We're in a dense, humid stretch of woods near Gary, Indiana. A family is out foraging for wild mushrooms, a weekend tradition. The 10-year-old son wanders about 100 yards into the thicket, near the remains of an old campfire. He doesn't find mushrooms. He finds a skeleton. The Gary PD arrives, and they're looking at a scene that feels like a forgotten ritual. There's a beer crate, some empty bottles, and a body that has been partially covered with branches, not by nature, but by human hands. The problem? The elements have been cruel. There are no fingerprints. The teeth are almost entirely gone. Only 2 remained. In the mid-'80s, identifying a Jane Doe with no dental records and no prints was virtually impossible. They assumed she was part of the local homeless population, someone who had slipped through the cracks of the industrial decline. They figured a group had been drinking, things escalated, and she was left there.
They didn't even have a name to put on the headstone.
But the coroner noticed something during the autopsy. Inside the victim's right shin bone, there were 4 surgical screws. This is the outlier, Sam. This is the digital fingerprint before the digital age. Those screws were part of something called a Targon nail,
Don't lie to me.
a medical implant used to stabilize severe fractures. The detectives didn't give up. They tracked the manufacturer, then the distributor, then finally a hospital in Chicago. They started digging through surgical records from 1978. They were looking for a woman who had been admitted with a compound fracture of the lower leg. And they found her. Sylvia, a 30-year-old mother of 2 who had been struggling with life on the streets. The tragedy of Sylvia's case is that her parents hadn't seen her in 5 years, but they had never stopped looking. They told the police that just months before the body was found, a friend of Sylvia's had called them. He said Sylvia was out in the woods near a campfire with her boyfriend, a man named
You should have
Stefan.
stayed silent.
She was planning to tell him it was over. That was the last time anyone heard her voice. But here's the twist. The justice in this case didn't come from a courtroom. When the police went to find Stefan, they discovered he was already dead. In July of 1984, just weeks after Sylvia disappeared, Stefan had walked onto a set of train tracks and waited for the engine to hit him. He had committed a suicide of conscience. He couldn't live with what he'd done at that campfire. If she hadn't broken her leg years prior, if those 4 screws hadn't been forged with a serial number, she would still be a Jane Doe in a potter's field, and her parents would still be waiting for a phone call that would never come. The final case in this archive takes us to November 1988. A cold, gray stretch of Interstate 95 near Richmond, Virginia. Kelly is 21 years old, a pharmaceutical sales rep with a bright future and a reputation for being incredibly cautious. She wouldn't even stop for a coffee with a stranger. So when her company car was found abandoned at a rest stop 2 days after she disappeared, the police knew immediately this wasn't a runaway situation. The car was unlocked. The keys were in the ignition. The gas tank was bone dry. But the most chilling detail was on the inside of the windshield. Right there, on the driver's side, was a faint, muddy boot print pressed against the glass from the inside. It told a story of a violent, desperate struggle. Kelly had been fighting for her life in that front seat, kicking at the glass, trying to break out while someone held her down. There was no blood, but the car was a graveyard of micro-traces. In 1988, they did what they could. They used those same adhesive tape lifts on the seats. They found foreign fibers, navy blue polyester that didn't match anything Kelly owned. But without a suspect to compare them to, the fibers were just colorful dust. The case went into the cold case drawer in 1989. It stayed there for 20 years. In 2008, a DNA specialist at the state lab pulled those old tape lifts. He wasn't looking for fibers this time. He was looking for what they call touch DNA. He processed over 500 different spots from those tapes. He found 7 distinct male profiles in that car. 6 of them were ruled out. They belonged to mechanics, family members, or previous passengers. But the 7th profile? It belonged to a man named Winfried, and Winfried was already in the system. He was a known offender with a history of predatory behavior and drug addiction. When they tracked the timeline, they found that on the day Kelly disappeared, Winfried had walked out of a nearby rehab clinic. He was desperate for a way to get back to his home state, over 100 miles away. He had been hitchhiking along the I-95. He likely saw Kelly, young, alone, in a reliable company car, and he saw an opportunity. He claimed later that he only talked to her through the window, that maybe his DNA drifted into the car through the breeze. But the science said otherwise. His DNA wasn't just near the window, it was concentrated on the driver's seat and the steering wheel. The jury didn't buy the drifting DNA theory. 20 years after that boot print was pressed against the glass, Winfried was sentenced to life. What ties all these cases together, from the industrial outskirts of Flint to the woods of Indiana and the highways of Virginia, is the terrifying reality of the butterfly effect. If Emily's friends had been on time, if Sylvia hadn't decided to end the relationship that night, if Kelly hadn't run out of gas at that specific rest stop. 5 minutes. That's all the margin there is between a life lived and a file closed. We like to think of these killers as monsters who look different from us, but the archives tell a different story. They are the men in the Norwegian sweaters. They are the boyfriends at the campfire. They are the hitchhikers on the side of the road. They are people who can kill and then go home and act like nothing happened for 25 years. But the modern world is closing in on them. Every time a forensic tech pulls a piece of tape from 1980, every time a serial number is found on an old medical implant, the shadows get a little smaller. These cases prove that there is no such thing as a perfect crime. There is only a crime that hasn't met modern technology yet. As we close these folders and put them back into the vault, remember this: the past isn't dead. It's just waiting for the right lab tech to wake it up. Every skin scale, every fiber, and every surgical screw is a silent witness that never stops talking. And eventually, someone is always listening.